In the autumn of 1908, that year of quiet change and shifting fortunes, the waters of Lake Champlain held more than just the usual day's catch. She held secrets. She did. Deeper than any channel, colder than any winter wind that whipped across her surface. And some of those secrets, once stirred, refused to settle back into the silt. They clawed their way into the light, even decades later, like a persistent chill that never quite leaves the bone. What happened out near Split Rock Point? It was the kind of thing folks would rather forget, or dismiss as the ramblings of men who'd spent too long breathing in the lake mist. But some of us, we remember. We remember every single chilling minute of it. I was a young man then, Thomas McKenna, not yet 30. Lean as a whip and quick with a net. Like most men who spent their lives pulling a living from the cold heart of Lake Champlain. My hands then were strong and steady, not like these old things, gnarled and trembling with the years. But even then, they could tell a story, those hands, of the rough ropes and the biting cold, the endless rhythm of the lake. I was out there with William Hodges, a man whose face was a map of every storm and sunrise he'd ever seen, lines carved deep around his eyes, from squinting into the glare and the fog. He was the elder, our leader, with a thick beard already showing the first flecks of gray, and a quiet authority that came from knowing the lake better than his own reflection. His younger brother Samuel was with us too. Samuel was a nervous sort, younger than me by a few years, with eyes that always seemed to be looking for trouble, or finding it where there was none. He was quick to laugh, quicker to worry, and still learning the hard lessons the lake taught every man who dared to challenge her. It was late September, the air already carrying the metallic tang of coming winter, the scent of pine and damp earth heavy on the breeze. We pushed off from the Burlington docks long before the sun even considered rising, the gas lights of the town already distant to blurs behind us. Our two wooden boats, small and sturdy, cut silent paths through the pre-dawn gloom, powered by the rhythmic dip of oars and the whisper of canvas as we caught what little breath the wind offered. There was a particular quiet that morning, though, even for that hour, an unnatural stillness that wrapped around us like a shroud. The kind of silence that doesn't feel peaceful, but rather, like the world itself, is holding its breath. The fog, when it came, wasn't a gentle drift. It descended like a curtain drawn by an unseen hand, thick and low-hanging, turning the vast expanse of Lake Champlain into a claustrophobic gray tunnel. Visibility shrank to a few boat lengths, the shore vanishing behind us, the world reduced to the immediate ripple of our passage and the spectral glow of our lanterns. The cold, too, was different. It wasn't just the bite of autumn air. It was a deeper chill that seeped into the bones, penetrating thick woolens and oilskins, a damp, ancient cold that felt older than the lake itself. Sounds became muffled, distorted, swallowed whole by the mist. The creak of oars, the lapping of water against the hull, even our own hushed voices, seemed to dissolve almost before they reached our ears. It was a world, hushed, muted, waiting. William, steady as ever, navigated by instinct and the faint familiar pull of the currents as we aimed for the fishing grounds near Split Rock Point. That was a good spot, known for its deep channels and the promise of a decent haul. We moved with the efficient, unspoken choreography of men who had done this 1,000 times. Every movement was practiced, every knot familiar, every pull of the oar a part of the ingrained rhythm of our lives. We reached the point as the gray light began to soften the edges of the fog, though the sun itself remained a rumor behind the impenetrable cloud. We dropped our anchors, the chains rattling softly, and began to set our lines. The familiar weights of the nets, the cold, wet feel of the ropes, the promise of the day's labor. It was a comfortable normalcy, a grounding routine against the unsettling quiet of the lake. William kept an eye on the water, his brow furrowed, always reading the subtle shifts, even when there seemed to be no shifts to read. Samuel, meanwhile, fidgeted a bit, pulling his cap lower against the persistent chill, his anxious eyes darting into the swirling mist as if expecting something to materialize from the gray. It was me who saw it first. Just a dark shape, a long, indistinct mass, perhaps 30 yards off our starboard bow. It was low in the water, barely breaking the surface. I figured it for a drifting log, maybe some old timber, washed down from the logging camps further north. "Looks like a good bit of cedar, William," I called out, my voice barely above a whisper in the hush, pointing with my chin. "Might be worth tying off and taking in." William squinted through the mist. "Aye, could be. Keep an eye on it." But even as he spoke, something felt wrong. The log wasn't drifting with the current. It was holding its position, almost against it, impossibly still. Then it moved. Not a drift, not a bob, but a deliberate glide, cutting a smooth, V-shaped wake through the glass flat water. No paddle, no oar, no engine. Just the steady, unhurried glide of something massive beneath the surface, pushing water before it. My breath hitched. Samuel, who'd been watching too, let out a small, choked sound. What in God's name? William's eyes were fixed on the shape now, his jaw tight. He rubbed a hand over his beard, a nervous habit I'd only ever seen when the weather turned truly ugly. "It's a trick of the fog," he muttered, though his voice lacked its usual conviction. "Light playing games?" But the light wasn't playing games. The shape continued its silent, purposeful movement. It wasn't a straight line either. It began to curve, slowly, deliberately, in a wide arc. An arc that was bringing it around us, around both our boats. It kept its distance, maybe 30 yards, maintaining that unnerving, unhurried pace. "It's circling us," I said, the words feeling heavy in the thick air. It wasn't a question, but a statement of dawning, cold fact. The air had grown colder, I thought, or maybe that was just the fear working its way into my bones. William didn't answer right away. His eyes were still fixed on the gliding form. He pulled his own line in slowly, deliberately, as if not to disturb the water, as if any sudden movement might break this fragile, terrifying stillness. The dark shape completed its first wide, deliberate arc, the V-shaped wake spreading out behind it, a perfect, impossible ripple in the otherwise unmarred calm. It was not a log. It was not a trick of the fog. It was something else entirely, and it was watching us. "I see it." "Thomas," William said, his voice flat, devoid of its usual booming authority. His gaze was still locked on the dark shape, which had now begun its second wide, deliberate arc. The initial disbelief had fled his face, replaced by a grim, unblinking focus. He still held his fishing line, though it hung slack in the water, forgotten. The illusion of a drifting log had evaporated like morning mist under a harsh sun. This was no timber, no flotsam. This was something alive, and it was moving with a purpose that chilled the blood. Samuel, in the other boat, was no longer just fidgeting. He was trembling, a visible tremor that ran through his shoulders. His anxious eyes, usually darting, were now fixed wide and disbelieving on the gliding form. It's not a fish, William," he stammered, his voice barely a breath. "It's too big, too quiet." The words hung in the air, heavy and true. The lake, usually full of the subtle sounds of life beneath the surface, was unnaturally silent around that dark shape. William, ever the leader, tried to reassert some semblance of control, though his own certainty was clearly fraying. "Keep fishing, both of you," he grunted, the command more a reflex than a conviction. "Don't stare at it. It's probably just a school of porpoise, or some kind of whale that's lost its way." He knew, and we knew, that Lake Champlain held no whales, no porpoises that could account for such a mass. His words were hollow, a desperate attempt to cling to the familiar. But the creature, for that is what it was, paid his words no mind. It continued its slow, unwavering trajectory, its V-shaped wake a perfect, unsettling line across the undisturbed water. 30 yards it kept, never closer, never further. It was as if it had drawn an invisible boundary, a perimeter it would not breach, but from which it would not depart either. The air around us seemed to thicken, pressing in, heavy with unspoken dread. The cold, which had been a damp chill, now felt like a deep, ancient presence, radiating from the water itself. Samuel let out a sharp gasp, almost a whimper. He pointed a trembling finger. "It's got humps, like a rowboat turned upside down." And he was right. As the creature completed the first half of its second circuit, a section of its immense body rose higher from the water, then another, then a third. 3 distinct humps, dark and sleek as wet granite, broke the surface, then settled back down, barely disturbing the glassy calm. They weren't sharp or jagged, but smooth, rounded, like the back of some impossibly large, ancient beast. They were big, too. Not the small ripples of a surfacing fish, but massive, significant forms that gave a terrifying sense of the bulk submerged beneath. The water simply folded around them, a testament to the creature's immense yet graceful power. It was like watching mountains shift beneath a silken sheet. "Just keep still," William said again, his voice lower this time, almost a plea. He wasn't barking orders anymore. He was trying to keep the delicate balance, the fragile peace of the moment. We were 2 small boats, adrift in a sea of gray, held captive by something utterly beyond our understanding. The only sound was the faint lapping of water against our hulls and the ragged cadence of our own breathing. The creature's second circuit felt longer than the first, an eternity measured in the slow, deliberate glide of its form. My hands, which had been automatically coiling line, were now still clenching the rough wood of the gunwale. My eyes burned, fixed on that dark, undulating mass, trying to discern more, trying to make sense of the impossible. Every fiber of my being screamed for movement, for escape. But William's quiet command held me, held us both, paralyzed by a fear that was not of attack, but of the unknown. Then, as the creature began to swing into its third and final circle, Samuel cried out, a strangled, guttural sound that tore through the quiet. "Its head! I saw its head, like a horse's, William, but broader. Oh God, William, look!" He was no longer just anxious. He was truly breaking, his voice rising in a thin, reedy wail. My gaze snapped to where Samuel was pointing, but the fog, or perhaps the creature's own subtle movement, had already swallowed the detail. But William had seen it too. I could tell by the sudden, sharp intake of his breath, the way his shoulders slumped, as if a great weight had just been placed upon them. He said nothing, but his eyes, when they met mine for a fleeting moment, were wide with a terror I had never seen there before. The deep-seated caution that usually lined his face had become something else entirely, a profound, sickening dread. The creature continued its methodical sweep, unhurried, unwavering. Now, having heard Samuel's terrified description and seen William's reaction, I strained my own eyes. I tried to imagine a horse's head, but broader, dark, and wet, rising from the cold depths. The image, once planted, took root in my mind, growing more vivid, more horrifying with each passing second. It wasn't the head of a fish, not the blunt snout of a seal. A horse's head implied something else entirely, something mammalian, something with a face, with an expression, even if that expression was unreadable, ancient, and utterly alien. William finally spoke, his voice hoarse. "3 humps, Thomas," he murmured, almost to himself, as if still trying to convince his own ears. "Like overturned boats, 40 feet, at least, and a head. Aye, a head." He didn't elaborate on the head, but the way he said "a head" was enough. It was the confirmation, spoken by the most pragmatic man I knew, that what we were seeing was real, impossible, and terrifying. The creature completed its third full circle. 20 minutes it had been. 20 minutes of silent, deliberate observation. It hadn't come closer. It hadn't shown aggression. It had simply watched. It had studied us with a patience that felt older than time itself, a profound, unsettling intelligence that stripped us of our simple assumptions about the natural world. We weren't just 3 men fishing. We were specimens, examined under a cold, ancient gaze. The silence that followed the completion of that third circle was different. It wasn't merely the muffling of the fog. It was a silence imbued with meaning, a silence that felt like a judgment. The creature didn't move away. It didn't disappear into the mist. Instead, it seemed to settle, perhaps 100 yards off, its humps occasionally breaking the surface like dark, fleeting islands. Its presence was still undeniably there, a massive, unseen weight in the water, watching. It was a proprietor of the lake, studying its transient visitors. And in that moment, we knew, with a certainty that chilled us deeper than any autumn wind, that we were not alone, and that our world, the world we thought we knew, had just grown impossibly larger and infinitely more terrifying. The creature had finished its deliberate inspection. It didn't vanish, didn't flee. It simply settled, 100 yards or so to our port side, a dark, immense shadow in the mist. Occasionally, a hump would rise, smooth and wet, like a polished stone, then slowly sink back into the gray water, leaving barely a ripple. It was there, unmistakably, a presence that stretched across the water, a silent, unblinking sentinel. It was a weight, not just in the lake, but in the air itself, pressing down on us, stifling breath, stealing words. We remained frozen, our boats drifting almost imperceptibly, with the slow, unseen current. The fishing lines, still out, were forgotten, their cork floats bobbing uselessly in the water. We couldn't fish. We couldn't move. We couldn't even truly speak. The silence, once merely an absence of sound, had become a living thing, thick and heavy, punctuated only by the soft, rhythmic creak of our boat against the water and the frantic thumping of my own heart. The cold, which had settled deep into my bones minutes ago, now felt like a part of me, a permanent resident, chilling me from the inside out. Samuel, huddled in the bow, was trembling visibly. His eyes, wide and bloodshot, darted between the spot where the humps occasionally appeared and the impenetrable wall of fog that surrounded us. He began to whisper, a low, desperate mumble that barely carried over the water. "It's the devil, William," he rasped, his voice thin and raw. "It's the devil himself come up from the deep, or a spirit, a lake spirit. My grandmother used to tell stories, things that wait for men who stray too far." He pulled his worn wool cap lower over his ears, as if it could somehow shield him from what he was saying, from what he was seeing. "It knows us, William. It knows we're here. It's watching." William, usually so steady, so much the rock, seemed to shrink within himself. He didn't reprimand Samuel, didn't try to silence him. He just gripped the tiller, his knuckles white, his gaze fixed on the spot where the creature waited. The color had drained from his face, leaving it a pasty gray beneath his weathered tan. He looked older, suddenly, decades older than his 40-odd years. His authority, which had always been as solid as the rock of Split Rock Point itself, was dissolving, piece by agonizing piece, under the unrelenting pressure of the unknown. Finally, after what felt like an hour, though it couldn't have been more than 10 minutes, William stirred. He took a deep, shuddering breath, then slowly let it out. His voice, when it came, was barely a whisper itself, rough and strained. "We need to go," he said, not looking at us, but speaking to the fog, to the creature, to the vast, indifferent lake. "We can't stay here." It was the only sensible thing to say, the only course of action left to us. But the thought of movement, of breaking the fragile stillness, felt like an immense risk. What if moving provoked it? What if its silent watch was merely a prelude to something more terrible? The creature hadn't attacked, hadn't shown aggression, but its intelligence, its methodical observation, was far more unsettling than any blind, instinctual rage. "Pull the lines," William commanded, his voice gaining a fraction of its former strength, though still hushed. "Slowly. Don't make any sudden moves. Just slowly." My hands, stiff with cold and fear, fumbled for the line. Each movement felt amplified, a loud, clumsy disturbance in the profound silence. The weight of the net, usually a familiar comfort, now felt like a leaden burden, dragging against the unknown depths. I pulled the line in, hand over hand, trying to keep my movements smooth, deliberate, as if I were performing some sacred ritual that, if broken, would bring down an ancient wrath. Samuel, still muttering under his breath, mimicked my actions, his movements jerky and uncertain. William Isteneo, the lead boat, pulled his own lines with the same agonizing slowness. He didn't look up until his nets were stowed, then he reached for his oars. The scrape of wood against wood, as he unlatched them from their resting place, sounded like a thunderclap in the muted world. He placed them carefully into the oarlocks, then turned to us. "We head east," he whispered, pointing vaguely into the fog, "towards the Burlington shore. Stay close. Don't fall behind." The plan was simple, direct, sensible, but the creature was between us and the shore. It had positioned itself, with unnerving precision, directly in the path we needed to take. We all knew it. The unspoken understanding hung in the cold air, heavier than the fog itself. William dipped his oars, pulling a short, tentative stroke. The blade sliced into the water with a soft sigh. Our boats, tied together at the stern, began to drift forward, slowly, cautiously, towards the impenetrable gray. Every fiber of my being was screaming, at me to row, to pull with all my strength, to flee this place. But William's instructions were clear. Slowly. We were trying not to provoke it, not to announce our intentions too loudly. We were trying to slip away, unnoticed, from something that had already seen us, studied us, and understood us. We had moved perhaps 30 yards, the rhythmic creak of William's oarlocks the only sound, when it happened. Not a sudden lunge, not a splash, not a chase, but a shift. The dark humps, which had been visible off our port, were now subtly, almost imperceptibly, to our starboard. The creature had moved, keeping itself perfectly positioned, a living barrier between us and the safety of the shore. It hadn't come closer. It hadn't shown any aggression. It had simply adjusted. William stopped rowing. He stared into the mist where the creature now waited. His jaw was clenched so tight I could see the muscles jump in his cheek. He tried again, changing course slightly, angling the boats to the northeast, hoping to outflank it, to find a path around the immense, unseen body. He pulled a few more strokes, the effort visible in the set of his shoulders. And again, the subtle shift. The humps, fleeting and dark, appeared precisely where they needed to be, precisely where our escape route lay. It was like trying to walk around a wall that moved with you, always keeping itself in the way, always blocking the path. It was a silent, infuriating game of cat and mouse. Only the mouse knew it was being played with, and the cat wasn't even bothering to show its teeth. Its patience was absolute, its control undeniable. Samuel began to sob, soft, choked sounds that tore at the quiet. "It won't let us go, William," he whimpered, burying his face in his hands. "It won't let us leave." I felt a cold dread bloom in my chest, a deeper chill than the lake could ever provide. He was right. It wasn't just a creature. It was a jailer. We were trapped. Not by a physical barrier, but by a psychological one, by the profound, unsettling intelligence of this ancient thing. William tried one more time, rowing southeast, directly opposite our original course. He pulled harder this time, his frustration and fear warring with his caution. The boats picked up a little speed, cutting a faint wake through the still water. For a moment, a flicker of hope ignited. Maybe we could outmaneuver it. Maybe it only had a limited range of movement. But then, as if in answer to our desperate attempt, the fog around us thinned. Not completely, but just enough. A momentary break, a fleeting window in the gray veil, perhaps brought by a subtle shift in the wind, or merely the lake's cruel jest. And in that brief, awful clarity, I saw it. Perhaps 100 yards out, where the humps had been, a section of the creature's immense body rose higher than before, a dark, massive curve that was not an overturned boat, but flesh and bone. And from that body, just above the waterline, a head emerged. It was as Samuel had described, like a horse's, but broader, much broader, sleek and dark, as polished obsidian, dripping water. Its snout was long, its jawline powerful, and its ears, if they were ears, lay flat against its head, almost indistinguishable from the curve of its skull. It was ancient, primal, utterly alien, but it was the eye that held me. A single dark eye, large and round, like a polished stone fixed on our boat. It wasn't the unseeing gaze of a fish, nor the panicked stare of a deer. This eye held an intelligence so profound, so ancient, that it stripped me bare. It was neither malicious nor kind, neither curious nor indifferent. It was simply knowing. It saw us, not as threats, not as prey, but as transient specks on its vast eternal domain. There was no emotion, no discernible expression, but in that silent, unblinking stare, there was something far worse. A profound understanding. It was a look that seemed to say, I know you. I have seen your kind. For generations, you are nothing to me, yet I observe. It was the wrong smile moment, though there was no smile. Only that terrible, silent communication. The creature wasn't just watching us, it was telling us something, without a sound, without a gesture, simply through the terrible weight of its knowing gaze. It was a proprietor of the lake, studying its transient visitors, and we were nothing but visitors. The fog, as quickly as it had parted, closed back in, swallowing the creature whole, leaving only the image of that dark, knowing eye seared into my mind. But its presence remained, a palpable force in the swirling mist, an invisible wall holding us captive. We were adrift, paralyzed by the chilling certainty that we were being held, not by force, but by a deliberate, patient will. William, too, had seen it. I could tell by the way he slumped over his oars, his head bowed, his shoulders shaking, not with sobs, but with a silent, profound despair. He had seen the eye. He had understood the message. And in that moment, the last vestiges of his leadership, his authority, his very understanding of the natural world had shattered. The lake, which had been his life, had betrayed him, revealing a secret so terrible, so ancient, that it broke a man's spirit. "It knows," Samuel whispered from behind me, his voice barely audible, raw with terror. "It knows." He was right. It knew, and it was still watching, waiting. William slumped over his oars, lifted his head slowly. His eyes, though shadowed with what I knew was utter defeat, still held a spark. Not of hope, but of something colder, harder, desperation. He looked at Samuel, huddled and whimpering, then at me. There was a terrible calculation in his gaze. He took a deep, shuddering breath, the sound rasping in the heavy air. "This ain't workin'," he rasped, his voice raw, barely a whisper. "It won't let us pass." He paused, then his eyes flicked to a point in the mist, not toward shore, but off to the north, towards a distant, less familiar stretch of coastline. "We'll run for Marble Island. It's further, but it's a different way." He didn't wait for us to answer. He didn't ask. This was not a discussion. This was the last gamble of a man who had nothing left to lose but his life. He adjusted his grip on the oars, his knuckles white. "On three," he said, his voice gaining a sudden fierce edge. "When I say three, pull like hell. Don't stop. Don't look back. Just pull." Samuel lifted his head, his eyes wide and red-rimmed. "William, no! It'll—" "One," William cut him off, his voice flat, brooking no argument. "Two, three." He plunged his oars into the water with a violent splash, pulling with a force I hadn't seen in him all morning. The wood groaned. Our boats, still lashed together, lurched forward, suddenly breaking the oppressive stillness. I instinctively mirrored his effort, digging my own oars deep, pulling with a frantic, desperate energy. Samuel, startled into action, snatched up his oars and began to pull too, though his strokes were weaker, less coordinated, punctuated by choked gasps. The fog, which had seemed so impenetrable, now felt like a suffocating blanket, pressing in, blurring everything into indistinct gray. We were rowing blind, guided only by William's desperate instinct, our muscles screaming with the effort. The cold air burned in my lungs. The rhythmic splash of our oars, once a gentle lullaby, was now a frantic drumbeat against the silence. We had gained some speed, the bows of our boats cutting through the calm water, creating a noticeable wake. For a precious few moments, there was nothing but the sound of our ragged breathing and the straining wood. Hope, thin and fragile, flickered again. Maybe it had worked. Maybe we had caught it off guard. Maybe it hadn't anticipated this sudden, desperate change of direction. Then a ripple. Not a splash, not a violent disturbance, but a subtle, impossibly fast ripple in the water ahead off our port bow. The dark humps, which had been off our starboard just moments before, now appeared directly in front of us, further out, but unmistakably ahead. It hadn't pursued us with aggression. It hadn't crashed into us or tried to capsize our boats. It had simply moved. Faster than we could have imagined. Faster than any creature that size had a right to move. It was still there, still blocking our path, still the proprietor, maintaining its invisible perimeter, its silent, intelligent observation. William let out a guttural cry, more animal than human. He didn't stop. He couldn't. He veered sharply, trying to outflank it again, wrenching the oars with all his might. Our boats swung wide, creating a chaotic churn in the water. Samuel sobbed louder now, a broken sound. I kept pulling, my eyes fixed on William's straining back, on the indistinct gray ahead. The creature matched us. Its movements were fluid, effortless. We were flailing, thrashing, desperate. It was flowing, purposeful, precise. The humps, like dark islands, kept appearing, always 100 yards or so out, always between us and the nearest land. It was playing with us, I realized, with a fresh wave of terror. It was allowing us to struggle, to expend our energy, to feel the full, crushing weight of its inescapable presence. We rowed, and it moved. We changed course, and it adjusted. The chase was silent, agonizing, stretching on for what felt like hours, though it could only have been minutes. My arms ached. My shoulders burned. My breath came in ragged gasps. Samuel was openly weeping, his strokes faltering, his face pale and slick with sweat and tears. William, grim-faced, continued to pull, his jaw set, his eyes fixed on the shifting mist. He was beyond exhaustion, beyond fear. He was simply trying to survive. Then, for some reason I will never understand, it changed. The humps, which had been steadfastly before us, began to recede. Not suddenly, not with a burst of speed, but with a gradual, almost imperceptible withdrawal. They moved off to our starboard, slowly, steadily, widening the gap. The pressure, the invisible wall, began to lift. Had we finally found an angle it didn't care to cover? Had it tired of its game? Or, and this was the thought that chilled me most deeply, had it simply decided we had learned our lesson? Had it decided, in its ancient, profound intelligence, that we were no longer worth its time? That we were permitted to leave? I dared not look back. I dared not even slow my stroke. William, too, kept pulling, his eyes still fixed ahead, straining for any sign of land. We were not escaping. We were being released. The distinction was terrifying. We rode until our muscles screamed in protest, until the very thought of another stroke brought nausea. We rode until the fog began to thin in earnest, revealing faint, dark shapes on the horizon. Trees, land, Marble Island. We didn't aim for the small, rocky shore of the island itself, but for the mainland beyond it, a stretch of rocky beach and dense woods. We pulled with the last reserves of our strength, each stroke a desperate prayer. The water grew shallower, the bottom visible through the murky green. We scraped against stones. William, without a word, leapt out, sinking up to his knees in the icy water, dragging his boat forward. I followed, my legs numb, my breath catching in my throat. Samuel splashed out behind me, stumbling, almost falling. We dragged the boats, heavy with water and equipment, onto the wet, stony shore. We didn't bother to pull them further, didn't bother to empty them. We just abandoned them there, where the waves would eventually claim them, or some other fisherman would find them. Our nets, our lines, our livelihoods, all forgotten. All we cared about was solid ground. We collapsed on the cold, damp rocks, gasping for air, our bodies shaking uncontrollably. The silence on shore was absolute, broken only by the gentle lapping of the waves and our own ragged breaths. We didn't speak. There was nothing to say. We just lay there, huddled together, three men stripped of everything but the terrifying, indelible memory of what we had seen, what we had felt. We had faced not a monster, but a mind. And that was far, far worse. Eventually, the first weak rays of the sun pierced through the thinning fog, painting the sky in pale, washed-out hues of gray and pink. The light felt wrong, alien after the profound darkness of the lake. We rose stiffly, our limbs aching, our minds still reeling. We began the long, silent walk back to Burlington, following the rough path along the shore. We didn't discuss what had happened. We didn't speak of it then, not on that long, cold walk, not for many years to come. What was there to say? How could we explain? Who would believe us? They would call us mad. They would say the fog had played tricks on our minds. They would say we were drunk, or worse, that we had simply lost our nerve. We were practical men, fishermen. We knew the lake. But this was beyond knowing. This was a truth that would shatter the orderly world they knew, and we had no desire to be the ones to shatter it. So we kept our silence, a heavy, unspoken pact between the three of us. The decades that followed were long, filled with other catches, other storms, other seasons on the lake. But the memory of that morning near Split Rock Point never faded. It was a phantom chill, a silent weight that we carried with us, a secret etched into our very bones. William eventually sold his boat, took up carpentry. Samuel never quite recovered. He grew quieter, more withdrawn, his eyes always seeming to hold a distant, haunted look. He died young, I think, of a consumption that had more to do with the soul than the lungs. Years passed. Our story, our sworn affidavits, only came out much later, in the 1930s, when other accounts, less detailed, more scattered, began to surface. Other fishermen, other boaters, all describing a great humped creature in the depths of Lake Champlain. The Burlington papers, as I said, first dismissed them as fisherman's fancy, or fog-induced delusion. But then the reports became too numerous, too consistent. Respected townsfolk, people with no history of exaggeration, began to add their voices to the growing chorus. That's when they found us, or rather, found William, and then me. We were old men by then, our hands gnarled, our backs bent. But our memories were sharp, crystalline in their horror. We told our story, carefully, precisely, recounting every detail of that morning. We signed our names, swore on the Bible, laid out the truth as we had seen it. The authorities, the academics, they listened. They made their notes. They nodded. But I saw the skepticism in their eyes, the polite disbelief. They wanted a monster, a simple beast, something they could classify, contain, explain away. They didn't want a proprietor, a knowing intelligence that transcended their understanding. Our story, with its lack of violence, its focus on observation rather than attack, confused them. It didn't fit their narratives of the wild, of man against beast. In the end, our affidavits were filed away, cataloged, then quietly suppressed. They called it a legend, a local myth, a product of overactive imaginations fueled by the lake's vastness and the pervasive fog. They didn't want to believe that something so ancient, so profoundly intelligent, could exist unseen, unheard, beneath the waters of their bustling modern world. It was too unsettling. It challenged too many assumptions. But I knew. We knew. The lake, they said, was just water, a resource, a place for recreation and industry. But it was more than that. It was a living, breathing entity with secrets older than human memory. Secrets that waited in the deepest channels, where the light never reached. My hands, even now, tremble a little when I think of that dark eye, that profound, knowing gaze. It wasn't a monster, no. A monster you can fight, you can flee, you can understand. This was something else. This was the proprietor of the lake, an ancient, patient intelligence that merely observed. It had allowed us to leave that morning, but it had never truly let us go. The memory, the chilling certainty of its existence, remained a permanent shadow on our lives. The lake still holds its secrets, even now, over 100 years later. Other reports, other whispers, still surface from time to time, echoes of our own encounter. People still venture out in their faster boats, with their brighter lights, their modern instruments. They think they know the lake, but it's still there, down in the cold, deep places, ancient, patient, watching, waiting for the next foolish souls to venture into its domain, to observe, to study, to learn, with a patience that transcends human time. And if you're very, very unlucky, it might just choose to observe you.